From Kansas State University, this is Agriculture Today. Glad to have you aboard. Eric Atkinson here. First up today, K-State's Robin Reid will talk about using financial ratios for benchmarking the economic performance of one's farm or ranch operation. She has just updated K-State's benchmarking tool that allows you to compare your financial status to that of peers around the state. Then the first of our wheat harvest updates featuring county and district extension agricultural agents around Kansas. Today's report from agents Justin Goodno of Barber County and Kelsey Nordyke of Cowley County. And on this week's horticulture segment, K-State's Ward Upham with recommendations to you home gardeners on harvesting onions, garlic, and potatoes. All that and more ahead on Agriculture Today. You are tuned in to Agriculture Today. Into the arena of farm financial management now, and an updated tool from the Agricultural Economics Department here at Kansas State University. It's of high usefulness to you producers as you figure out where you really stand financially with your enterprises and operation. We've invited by, once again, Robin Reid, agricultural economist with K-State Research and Extension, who has just finished bringing up to date the financial benchmarking tool that can be found on the agmanager.info website. We have, Robin, multiple times talked about the value in operational benchmarking, comparing operations to operations, right?
Yes, and really this is for an individual producer to take the ratios, financial ratios from their balance sheet and their income statement and say, how am I performing in relation to operations of similar size and scope to their own operation? What we do every year is update this with our Kansas Farm Management Association farms, and that's what we're using to benchmark against. One of the advantages of this tool, I have in there the most recent year, 2020, so you can compare how you did in 2020 versus our KFMA farms, and then a 10-year average. So it gives you two different values to benchmark against.
And once more, those numbers have been refreshed with the 2020 numbers that the Farm Management Association just posted, and how this tool works in making these key comparisons then.
So some unique aspects of this tool. If you look at a lot of other benchmarking tools, it'll give you one number for each ratio and then maybe some suggestions what's a good number and that kind of thing. Our tool shows a distribution. So you can look at your farm number compared to a distribution of your peers and be able to see what percent of farms are better or worse off than I am in each of 11 different financial ratios. So to give you an example here, let's just look at a current ratio. If you have a current ratio of 2, so $2 of assets for every $1 of current liabilities, that's on the threshold of a very good number. But when you look at the benchmarking graph, if you choose a cohort comparable to you, you could say, well, 45% of farms are worse off than that, and 55% of farms are better off than that. So it just gives you some more information, because a lot of times, depending on how long you've been farming, what size the operation, that kind of thing, that can influence what is a good financial ratio for you. So knowing what other farms are at is a really good piece of information.
Then it's really as easy as taking, as you cited the example, the current ratio of your operation and plugging it in and then seeing where it stands?
Exactly. And I'll go through some state numbers here just so we kind of can look at some trends. But, I just want to emphasize the value of this tool is at the individual level. Putting in your own ratios, or even just knowing your own ratios and looking at the distribution graphs and seeing where you fall within the group.
You have some examples and have identified, you say, Robin, some trends in benchmarking and these comparisons that we're highlighting here that you wanted to share.
Yeah, so I just like looking at 2020 compared to the 10-year average and seeing how we did. So I just picked out some of the biggest groups that you can in this tool, and that is all operators across the state that are less than 40 years of age and then another group that is between 40 and 60 years of age, just to see what are the trends between the two age groups. As we know, beginning farmers are facing a little more challenging times as they're getting going. Mm-hmm. But really, both groups had a decent year last year, and a lot of that was due to the government payments, the CFAP 1 and CFAP 2. So our younger operators, those less than 40, had a net farm income of around $125,000 last year, and that's compared to $107,000 on average for the past 10 years. Now, these are straight numbers, but if you look at that in ratio form, which this tool does, you can look at how good is that number, because as we know, bigger farms are going to have bigger net farm income. But at the ratio level, what it does is take for every dollar of revenue that comes into the operation, where did that dollar go? So for our younger farmers, 70 cents or 70% of that dollar went to operating expenses last year. Ideally, we want this to be 60% or less, but this is not vulnerable. This is a little bit at risk, but not bad. 6% going to depreciation for our younger farmers, 5% going to interest, and then 19% is left over for net farm income, or 19 cents of that dollar. Ideally, we want to have that over 20%, but 19 is fairly good for these younger farmers. Mm-hmm. So again, looking at the tool, how does your operation compare to these other younger farmers? How much of that dollar is going to those 4 different components? Now, when we look at our operators that are 40 to 60 years of age, they had a very good year last year. $220,000 in net farm income was the average for this group, which is a lot compared to those younger farmers, but you got to think these are probably larger operations that are more established. So let's again look at that in the ratio format. 66% of that dollar coming in went to operating expenses, so a little bit better than our younger farmers. 8% to depreciation, which is actually more than our younger farmers. But if you think about it, this generation or these older farmers probably have better, higher dollar equipment, probably are not hiring out or leasing out equipment or custom farming quite as much. 4% of that dollar coming in, or 4 cents, went to interest with these farmers, so a little bit less of an interest expense, probably have more things paid off. And then 22% was left over in net farm income. So you can see financially the picture there of the dollar coming in and where it's going, and that on a ratio level, those operators aren't terribly much better than the younger ones, but looking at just the net farm income number, they look quite a bit higher. So that's the value of looking at ratios.
And you've taken this one further, honing in on debt structure of operations, which of course is crucial to the overall story here.
Yes, and this is another one that is very important to look at. So when you're doing your balance sheet every year for your lender, or hopefully for yourself as you're doing your financial management, there are 2 critical things to look at. The first one being your current ratio and your working capital, and then the second one being your debt to asset ratio. So first, unpacking that current ratio, that's looking at how much current assets you have compared to current liabilities. And current just means anything that can be converted to cash in the coming year. So cash, crop inventory, market livestock, those kind of things. And then comparing that to your operating loan, your payments on your term debt that are due in this next year, and basically saying, do you have enough current assets to cover your current liabilities or what you owe this year? So in 2020, our younger farm group that I'm looking at here had a current ratio of 1.8. So for every dollar of liabilities, they had $1.80 of current assets were there to service those liabilities. So that's a pretty good number. But one thing to emphasize here, that was the average. And like I said, the information is in the distribution. So there's a lot of farms that were above and below that, even below $1, where they're still in some financial trouble. Compare that to 40 to 60-year-old operators, their average was 2.4, or $2.40 of current assets for every dollar of current liabilities that they have. So that's a really good financial position right now.
So does the debt to asset side of it then jive with those current ratio numbers?
Well, not necessarily. So sometimes your current picture looks drastically different than your overall picture, and that's why it's important to look at both. So debt to asset looks at what are your total assets on the farm, including your machinery, your land, all those longer term assets, compared to all of your liabilities on the operation. Basically says if you paid off all your debt today, not including tax liabilities, what would be left over that you own outright. So our younger farmers in 2020, this was about 50%. 50% of their assets were owned by them, 50% would be owned by creditors. Contrast that with our 40 to 60-year-old operators, their number was 28%. So 28% of their assets would be owned by creditors, the rest would be outright.
You share all of this, Robin, because it illustrates just how much analytics one can put into evaluating their own operations, their enterprises through benchmarking of this type.
Yes, and there's a lot more you can do with this tool than what I said today. I know over the radio here it's hard to kind of explain a lot of these different things, but I would really just encourage producers to get on there and play around with it. Even if they don't have their own numbers for all of these ratios, there's still a lot of value in at least looking at some of them for the numbers that are readily available.
Well, the tool is found on agmanager.info, as is a fine write-up that walks you through all the nuances of using the tool and how it can be of assistance to you in your farm financial management. Financial benchmarking is how it's labeled. Agmanager.info is where it's found. Thanks for going over this, Robin. As always, we appreciate it.
My pleasure, Eric. Thank you.
And that from agricultural economist Robin Reid, K-State Research and Extension. She has just now updated that tool, plugging in the new Kansas Farm Management Association numbers for 2020, along with the historical numbers, to allow you producers to compare how your operations are faring vis-a-vis your peers around the state of Kansas. And we'll be back with more on Agriculture Today. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and welcome back, as here we launch our series of visits with county and district extension agricultural agents from all around Kansas as they provide the word on how wheat harvest has gone in their respective locations around the state. And we'll start with the update from Cowley County in far south central Kansas and the extension agricultural agent there, Kelsey Nordyke. Are your producers nearing completion with their wheat cutting, Kelsey?
Well, to be honest, we're not quite as far as what I thought we would be. We're about 60% complete in Cowley County. And in fact, we started around the 13th of June. But I have a few producers, especially in the northern and the eastern part of the county, that are just getting started. So we're not quite as far along as you would expect.
Is that because of weather interruptions?
Weather interruptions, and I have a few people that had a good window for planting and quite a bit to get done, and so they wanted to get that knocked out before they cut their wheat. And there are also producers that didn't have as many acres of wheat to cut.
What were your expectations for the output of the crop in Cowley County going into harvest time?
We really were expecting a decent crop, decent to above average, actually, because some of our filling period was good. We had a nice long period of good weather for filling, and our harvest has actually reflected that. So yields have been average to above average, and I have heard anywhere from as low as 20 bushels to the acre, which is pretty low, up to 100 bushels to the acre. But most are seeing above 60, and test weights are average to above average as well.
Were there any complications with diseases in that there was plenty of moisture around in the spring and into early summer? Was that a detriment to the crop at all?
So I haven't heard a lot of disease pressure as long as you used fungicide. Now, I did hear several producers mention that if they didn't use fungicide, it definitely hurt them as much as 20 to 30 bushels.
Another year of testimony for the value of fungicides. Any other harvest interferences other than the rain?
We had one rain, and that was it, and it's pretty much dried off, and everybody's up and going. Other than the occasional breakdowns, we really haven't had any big interruptions.
Now, Kelsey, you and the Cowley County Extension Office maintain routinely wheat plots and testing varieties and performance. What sorts of things have you been looking at specifically in your test this year?
So our plots look at mostly yield, and we are tied in with most south central Kansas counties. So Cowley, Sumner, Sedgwick, Harvey, and Harper County all go together to plant our plots and then harvest those as well. And then our tours are held in conjunction with each other. I've heard good things about our plots so far. I was not present when the Cowley County plot was cut because I was at camp, but the plot looked great. We had very little disease pressure and very little weed pressure. So we're excited to hear those results as soon as we can get them.
And you will accumulate those, and those will be passed along to your producers at that time.
Yes.
In that there's been enough moisture anyway, have you had a few producers eyeing the prospect of double cropping or, in fact, going ahead and planting something following wheat?
Yes. Most of our producers will go ahead and double crop and are in the process of that at this point.
Largely soybeans?
Soybeans, and I have heard some milo. Our milo acres was up this year for Cowley County. I have not heard for sure if we're going to be up this coming year, but I know we're double cropping beans and a little bit of milo.
So, as you talk with your producers that have finished, and like you say, you've something around the order of 40% yet to go, they are probably gratified by how things have gone this year?
Yes, attitudes are good and spirits are high so far.
Very good. Well, thanks for the word. The best of luck to your growers as they move forward with that double crop and otherwise, Kelsey. Appreciate your time.
Thank you.
Kelsey Nordyke there. Kelsey is the Extension Agricultural Agent in Cowley County. Now we'll move a few counties west to Barber County and catch up on harvest progress there with Extension Agricultural Agent Justin Goodno. And your county is typically the launch point, Justin, for the harvest each year and gets going quite early, does that cutting. Are you nearing completion now?
Yeah, I'd say countywide, we're probably 85-90% done. There's just a few of them out there finishing up at this point.
Any problems with rainfall or other interference with harvest progress?
One day we caught a little rain, and other than that, it's been hot and dry.
That's as good for harvest, not so good for other things. What were your expectations going into the harvest in as far as how well this crop might do?
That's kind of a loaded question, Eric. Last year we had phenomenal wheat, and we knew we weren't going to have that. But, I'd say we thought we was going to have some good wheat, and we have. You look at the southern part of the county, from Hartner, Kiowa, that Hazleton area. The test weights have been good, around 63 or so. The yields, I'd say a safe average is probably 45, 50. We've got, some of those in the 30s. We've heard of some up in the 70s, and protein's been literally all over the board. Some of the cooperatives in the county are a little guarded with that information, but we do know of some, some 10s, 11s. We've heard of some that's up there in that 14 and 15 range. That Sharon area, kind of the center or more the middle part of the county, those yields are anywhere from 37 to 50, good test weights again, and protein, again, is all over the board. And then you get in the northern part of the county, and there was a little better wheat cut up there as well. It was a lot like the southern part. The big difference is we didn't catch the rains this year that we had last year. I talked to a producer that last year had a field that did 94. This year it did like 57.
Wow.
So therein lies the difference. But, we've overall, I'd say a good wheat crop. Not great, but, last year was one of them years that you don't get that often.
Still, test weights around that 62, 63 mark, that would indicate, for one thing, that the heat in the earlier part of June didn't shrink those berries too terribly much.
Yeah, that's been a fairly consistent thing through the county is good solid test weights.
What, if anything, did your producers do in a management sense that might have helped everything along here? Disease control, for one thing?
Yeah, the ones that we had some rust come through, and the ones that managed that well got along a lot better. I will say, in the northern part of the county, last year we had an issue with common bunt, and I don't think we've got near that issue this year. We were able to do some pre-plant work on that with Romulo and Kelsey and Eric from up on campus, did some webinars for us, and it provides some education. But the guys that really managed and were proactive got along a lot better.
It's been awfully dry, so any prospects for following wheat with a double crop, are they a little bit hindered there?
Somewhat. There are some guys getting out and trying it, though. We've got a chance of rain coming up at the end of this week. We'll see how it goes from there. But there are some guys that have started right now.
With grain sorghum by and large, or soybeans, or both?
Both. Yes, sir.
It was a good crop, as you said, not to the level of last year. Again, pretty reassuring to your producers as far as sticking with wheat when you have stands like this, isn't it?
Oh, you bet. I mean, we've got to take into consideration what we had last year. I've talked to one of the cooperatives, and he said those are the kind of years that are few and far between what we've seen last year. This is a little bit more normal, but when you're coming off a year like in 2020, it can seem like a downer, but in reality, it's a good, solid crop.
And the state of the market currently doesn't hurt either, does it?
Yes, sir. Yeah. Yes, sir.
Appreciate it, Justin. Thanks for your time and the report right here.
You bet. Thank you, Eric.
Justin Goodno is the Extension Agricultural Agent in Barber County, south central Kansas. And that's a glance at how progress has been going with wheat cutting along that southern border of the state. As we go on through the remainder of the next 2 or 3 weeks, we will hear from more county and district extension agricultural agents about how the wheat harvest is faring in their locations. Just to round this segment off, some notes from the wheat harvest report out this morning from Kansas Wheat. They note that disease pressure from stripe rust and wheat streak mosaic virus is taking a toll on yields in such places as McPherson County. Wheat streak is causing reductions of 15 to 20 bushels per acre in some affected fields. In far southwestern Kansas, Seward County, fields still pretty green, they're reporting. Some yields averaging between the mid-40s to 60 bushels per, test weights at 61 pounds per bushel. And in Ford County, some reports of 80 bushel yields on summer fallow fields, and the test weights are steady from 60 to 65 pounds. We'll see what these storms moving through the next day or two around the state have to say about the pace of harvest progress in Kansas. We'll be back shortly on Agriculture Today. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today over the K-State Radio Network. Eric Atkinson with you, and coming your way now, today's agricultural news headlines in brief, these courtesy in part of DTN. Yesterday, economists pointed to supply and demand, as well as repeated black swan events, in a hearing before the Senate Agriculture Committee to examine some of the challenges with the cattle markets. Now, a cow-calf producer from South Dakota, Justin Tupper, testified for the U.S. Cattlemen's Association at that hearing. He made the argument that since last year, packers are using slower processing speeds at plants and a tight labor market to increase their profitability, he said. His testimony was countered by Mark Gardner, a cattle producer from Ashland, Kansas. He testified on behalf of the National Cattlemen's Beef Association, and he pointed to some of the problems such as a bulge in cattle supply, while packing capacity has faced a spate of unusual market disruptions. Quoting Mark, "We have too many cattle and too little processing capacity, a volatile marketplace created by outside unavoidable factors and not one market player in particular. History shows," he said, "that there will be a point where packers adding process capacity will find themselves competing for a limited supply of cattle, and then producers will have more leverage at that time." Gardner defended producers who sell through alternative marketing arrangements and have focused over time on changing genetics, feed, and management to improve the quality of their cattle and their prices as a result. He opposes bills that have been introduced by multiple senators that would mandate as much as 50% of packer cattle buys come from cash market sales instead of AMA contracts. Gardner said such proposals would damage the market and potentially artificially manipulate prices. Also testifying at this hearing, K-State livestock economist Glenn Tonzer. He told the senators that the sheer size of the cattle industry must be appreciated, as he put it, before any proposed policy changes that would potentially have wide-ranging impacts. He also repeated during the hearing that he opposed any mandate for higher negotiated cattle trade, which he said would disrupt the growth of formula contracts during the past decade. Market mandates, he also said, add rigidity into the system. And Vice President and animal protein analyst for Rabobank, Dustin Aharon, said that market signals led to record cattle prices and packer losses back in 2014 and 15, which drove some inefficient packing plants out of business. Going back to 2000, he said, the beef industry saw a decline of roughly 14,000 head per day in processing capacity. Aharon said that negotiated cash trade level really hasn't changed. What has changed, he said, is the supply of cattle relative to demand, and because the oversupply of cattle relative to packing capacity is in effect, he said, nonetheless, that's going to change with plant expansions over the next several years. What are some examples of U.S. agricultural exports finding new and expanded markets in China via that Phase 1 trade agreement, and what other products could also benefit from that deal? Here's a look at that from the USDA's Rod Bain.
Among the benefits our nation's ag industry is receiving through the U.S.-China Phase 1 trade agreement.
We've opened up broader access for a bunch of products.
USDA Acting Deputy Undersecretary for Trade and Foreign Agricultural Affairs Jason Halfmeister, speaking at the recent American Seed Trade Association conference, offered examples of new and reestablished markets for U.S. ag goods in China.
Poultry ban was lifted, $1 billion exports, I hope, this year. Hormones, so we got a commitment there that they will recognize an MRL for synthetic hormones. They've removed the 30-month age limit. We're still fighting over some of the implementation of that, but China is now a great market for us in beef.
Yet he acknowledges there are also trade concerns.
The dried distiller grains, that's something we still are fighting about. Ethanol tariff is still a little too high for us. And we got a lot of commitments on biotech. Not everything that we wanted.
But with leverage through the Phase 1 deal to request specific commitments from China regarding biotech approvals. I'm Rod Bain reporting for the U.S. Department of Agriculture in Washington, D.C.
And President Biden, along with USDA Secretary Tom Vilsack, will be in Wisconsin next Tuesday to discuss agriculture and rural economies. That, according to the White House. Dairy likely to figure high on the list of issues that will be focused on, with the administration having announced additional aid will be coming to that sector over the next 60 days. But little detail on the aid plans as of yet. However, Wisconsin, a key state in the 2022 midterm election, so some kind of policy announcement may be forthcoming. And now, this week's Kansas soybean update with Greg Akagi. Greg?
Gina Perry joins us. She is the project director for global strategy with the World Initiative for Soy in Human Health. And Gina, WISH recently held a webinar, and I know you've been working on a number of webinars for different regions. And what are some of the objectives of the webinars?
So we have been holding quarterly webinars for the QSSBs and other farmer directors and stakeholders just to give them an update of what WISH is doing throughout our three regions. WISH works in Latin America, Sub-Saharan Africa, and Asia to provide training and promoting protein adoption within the food and feed sectors.
Because of the fact during the pandemic, hunger, lack of food, or shortage of food has been so important, but that also leads to human health and to be healthy and have soy be a part of that too.
That is correct. So many of the markets that we work in, there is a protein deficiency or protein gap, which addresses food security through, whether that's soy in human food or through aquaculture and poultry feed. So eventually those consumers are getting protein, whether it's directly through soy or those animals that eat soy.
Do you see that demand growing just because of the fact of where the areas that are protein deficient, are those areas starting to grow?
They are. So we are seeing a rise in the middle income class. So as income rises, people are more likely to buy protein. Sometimes that's through eggs, sometimes that's through animal products or milk. And then there are markets where we're seeing an increase in soy-based foods and beverages as well.
And, of course, you work in concert with the soybean industry, American Soybean Association, and others, and it's important to have those types of relationships to make what you do possible.
Absolutely. So we work very closely with the whole soy community, both with those state associations as well as the U.S. Soybean Export Council and United Soybean Board, which really works in those frontier markets where U.S. soy maybe doesn't have much of a presence. And those industries such as the poultry industry or aquaculture industry or even food processing really needs that capacity building to get them to a point where they are ready to import soy from the U.S.
That is Gina Perry. She is the project director for global strategy with the World Initiative for Soy and Human Health here on the Kansas Soybean Update. It's brought to you by the Kansas Soybean Commission.
Greg Akagi there. Thanks, Greg. And we'll be back on Agriculture Today. Welcome back to Agriculture Today, and each week we talk things horticulture in this time slot, and this time it's to the vegetable garden and harvest for several of those earlier planted crops. Ward Upham is here once again, horticulturist with K-State Research and Extension, with advice on harvesting successfully Ward 3 of our standard vegetables, onions, garlic, and potatoes. And there's technique to each of the three. Let's start with onions and how to be sure that those are ready for pulling.
That's right, because there's a wide variability on when onions are ready to harvest because they bulb in response to day length. And so a lot of our onions, like the sets, are going to really start to bulb early, others a little bit later. And if you get the long day onions, they can be well into July before they're ready to harvest. So what you look for is those tops. When about half of them have fallen over, it's time to pull the onions. And so you just pull them out of the ground and you move them to a shaded, well-ventilated area to let them dry.
They can, at times, you say, be susceptible to sunburn if not handled properly?
That's right. So that's when you pull them. It's a good idea to move them directly into the shade because without that shade, they can sunburn. And so you're going to leave them in that shady location where they're protected from excess moisture like rain until those tops are completely dried. And so about an inch above the top of that onion, you want that completely dry before you cut the tops off. Now, you don't have to cut the tops off. You can just tie them all together and hang them like that, but they need good ventilation so that even after they're dry, they're not in a big stack of layers. You want to have good ventilation for them.
And where one stores those onions in whatever fashion obviously makes a difference here.
It certainly does. And so you want cool and, if you can, kind of moist conditions, not wet, but where the air isn't terribly dry. And so you can use like an open mesh bag if you've seen how onions are stored if they're in quantity. That type of thing is really the best way to store them.
But not in a fully enclosed container of any kind.
Yeah, you don't put them in Ziplocs or anything like that. And so it just needs to be something that breathes well.
Onions that may have gone to seed, what to do about those?
Yeah, people often wonder, are they any good to eat? And they are, it's just that they're not going to store. So you pull those and you use them right away. Don't try to store them. They're not going to store well, but they're fine to use.
Other than that, onions can be harvested with relative ease. Just take those simple steps there. But is garlic harvest any different than onions?
It is. The tops on garlic doesn't get weak and fall over, so it's a little bit more of a challenge to tell when they're ready to go. look at the lower part of that garlic plant. When it starts to yellow and that yellow starts to move up on the plant, that's usually a good sign that they're ready to harvest. And this is going to be about the right time. And so what you use is something like a spading fork or something to lift them out. With onions, you just pull them. Usually half that bulb's out of the ground anyway. But with garlic, you'd use a spading fork or something like that in order to dig them up so that they can be separated from the soil. Just move them to a warm, again, shaded location under a tree, garage floor, anything like that where they can go ahead and dry. And you want to dry them for about 2 weeks, as long as that weather is warm and dry. If it's going to rain, you need to move them so that they don't get wet. Don't wash those bulbs, not until they're completely dry. They're going to be pretty tender after you dig them.
And then once they are dry, clean them off, put them in another cool location somewhere?
Yeah, cool, dry location, just like for onions, and so they'll be good to go. They'll store for a long time.
All right. And for those who have planted potatoes, some weeks now, months back, mid-March, somewhere in there, those ought to be pretty close to ready for digging. And you say our recent extreme hot weather pushed things along there.
It certainly did. And so usually what we wait for is for the tops of those to be about half dead. And so you don't wait for everything to die completely. When they're about half dead, then you can go ahead and start to dig them. Again, using a potato fork or garden fork or something like that to gently lift them out of the ground is going to be what you want to do, because they're really easily bruised at this stage. If you delay harvest too long, it allows those potatoes to heat up, and that's not good on them. And so once they're about half dead, then you can go ahead and start to lift them out of the ground.
And in fact, if you leave them way too long, they will start to sprout on their own, which is something you don't want, obviously.
That's right. Now, they do have a dormancy built in. And so if you harvest potatoes now and try to plant them for the fall, that often doesn't work. And so because there's that dormancy built in. Same thing if you buy potatoes from the grocery store and plant them, they usually are treated so they don't sprout. When you plant potatoes, you have to use seed potatoes. But once you dig them, just let them sit for 10 to 15 minutes to allow them to get a little bit tougher on that skin. Because as I said, they're really tender.
They'll bruise if you aren't careful.
Yeah, and that skin will tear very easily.
After you've gone through the digging and that brief time allowing them to harden up, if you will, still leave them outside for a short period?
Well, you're going to move them again to a shady location where they're not going to get wet and allow them to what we call set for a day or so. Again, that just allows that skin to toughen up so that when you move them to their final storage place, they're going to be less likely to be damaged in that process.
And then moving them into storage, first off, does one want to wash them off, clean them off? Because there's invariably some dirt left on those.
Usually I do not, because I'm too antsy about damaging that skin.
Right.
And so I just leave them the way they are. When you're ready to use them, if you want to wash them off, that's a good thing to do, but not when you put them into storage.
And as with the other two vegetables we talked of today, cool and dry conditions for storage?
Yeah, cool, relative high humidity is good, but not wet. And so that high moisture in the air can prevent moisture loss from the tubers themselves.
Typically, with the potato varieties that gardeners have on hand now, they will store without sprouting for several weeks, if not months, right?
Yeah, several weeks, if not months. And even then, you may want to go in, and if there are any sprouts, you break them off, and that will allow them to be stored for a little bit longer as well.
So once again, those are the procedures for harvesting your garden onions, your garlic, and your potatoes. And as Ward is suggesting, the time is nigh for getting that done. Ward, thanks for going over the tips right here.
You bet.
He is horticulturist Ward Upham, K-State Research and Extension. These sorts of topics and much more are covered in the horticultural newsletter out of K-State that Ward contributes to regularly. Just go to hnr.ksu.edu. That'll take you to the Horticulture Department's website. Or merely search for K-State Horticulture Newsletter. You'll find it that way as well. And that is this week's horticulture segment, capping off our Thursday edition. Thanks to you for being along with us. We'll be right back here this same time tomorrow and hope you will be likewise. Until then, Eric Atkinson for Agriculture Today. This is the K-State Radio Network.